Is Peter Ellerton, who's one of the directors of the UQ Critical Thinking Project here at UQ. He has a background in science, philosophy and education, and he's going to speak in a broad, overarching manner about some of the ideas that have been touched on by our other three speakers.
Thanks, Mel. And you can hear me, yes, but I'm going to have to steal one of these little clips. Hang on a second. Okay. Am I audible? A little bit. I'll turn myself up, perhaps. Excuse me a sec. Am I getting more audible? Oh, I am very audible. Back to mic mute. Okay, I'll start with this. Firstly, thank you to the speakers tonight. That was absolutely fantastic. It makes me realise how comprehensive my own notes were, because everything that was said has been covered so well. So thank you for that. So what I'll do, in light of that, is use that as an excuse to, if you like, summarise and perhaps categorise some of these issues in a slightly different way. Starting in a number of places, I think one of the things that, and Ben, you made this point rather well just then, is that we've got to be very careful about the use of the word objective. In fact, the phrase objective opinion is something of an oxymoron, if you think about it. Now, that's not to say, of course, that opinions aren't based in as much factual evidence as we can. But of course, I think we've all seen, and I'm sure you have particularly been in your context, the proof by volume of just laying down fact upon fact upon fact upon fact. At some stage, what we value is the subjective ability of the expert to sift through that and to infer to a particular place. And particularly in these cognitively complex domains of expertise, where simply having the facts laid out is insufficient to move towards something more substantial. So I think we need to be a bit careful that we don't conflate or just imagine that biases and subjectivities are simply the same thing. And if we just slice out all the subjectivity, we'll get rid of the biases. We may, but we'll also get rid of what we value in the experts themselves. So I think that's an important point. And I want to address, I don't want to leave it at that, but to say that comes back to one of the points later on about how we make that visible to others in our work. And to make the point, I suppose, it says in one of your papers, Catherine, I got this paper that we're talking about today, plus a previous one of yours to make it look like I'd really researched it well. And you did make the point, or someone makes the point in there, that forensic medicine might be less objective than other areas, and it's not. It's just as objective, it's just that it's also got subjective aspects to it. So we shouldn't minimise the value of the objectivity in there. And also seeing, I suppose, the concept of bias and error and uncertainty and how these terms relate to one another. This is a very complex and messy business. So I think some clarification around that is necessary. One of the interesting things about this concept of confirmation bias that we've all heard about, and the last example was in Ben's, the idea if you begin with a conclusion in mind, you seek then those things which will confirm it. It's a classic case of confirmation bias, beginning with that conclusion. And those conclusions arise from a kind of heuristic view of things. For those of you who have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's the business of what he's talking about. But also, the very definition of expert knowledge is that it's highly organised schematic knowledge that has become system one. It's a kind of heuristic. And the tension we have here is how do we make that knowledge visible so that we can assess it and explain it? Because what we do know from the research is that when experts explain how they came to a decision after the fact, they often get it wrong. when you actually match it against what they did, it's a mismatch. It's much more effective to have experts speak as they go, and you get a much different story, a more accurate story about what they do. And I think this is really quite interesting. And again, I want to come back in a later point to round that up. But we get our biases from anywhere. I mean, we all spin narratives. It's what we do. Humans make narratives. There's this lovely experiment. I'll just take a short time to describe. A paper by Lepper, Anderson and Ross in the 1980s called The Perseverance of Social Theories, where they divided a room into two and they said, Group A, we've discovered a very high correlation between being an effective firefighter and being a high risk taker. Now, we're not sure why that is, but I wonder if you can come up with some kind of explanatory framework around that. Help us out. That'd be good. Write it down. And then Group B, we've discovered a high correlation between being an effective firefighter and being a low risk taker. And we're not sure why, but if you could sort of write some kind of explanatory framework around that, that'd be terrific. So off they go. And then they come back and they say, everyone, we made it all up. There is no such connection that we're aware of. Do you understand it? Yeah, we do. And of course, in further testing, what we know is that when that information was discredited, the narrative survived to an astonishing degree. So we know we write narratives and we don't need data to perpetuate them. And that's something we do. We write narratives all the time. So we can get our initial starting positions from anywhere. And sometimes awareness brings no defence. It might bring offence, but it doesn't bring any defence. So, you know, that's the can of worms we open when we speak about cognitive biases is vast. And I also think that one of the starting points in managing bias is to some degree, simply accept that that's how we're built. And say, all right, given that we're like this, what kind of structures can we put in place to manage it? Okay, this idea that we just want to get rid of bias is probably just not going to happen. It's too difficult. We can certainly put structures in place. We can teach ourselves about these things, but the problem is we're often not aware that we have them, and that's very difficult. So one of the things that we can turn to in support of these ideas is our methodology, the analytic thinking that Karen, you spoke of, and the report writing that you spoke of, Ben, the forward thinking. All these processes are designed to do one thing well, and that is to make our thinking visible, to make our reasoning visible. And it's not just about setting out our reasons, but it's of course about setting out our reasons so that they are accessible to others. This really is what we want from experts that goes beyond their expert knowledge in their domain. How expert are they in describing their reasoning process? Because if their expertise is, and it is, a heuristic or series of heuristics, if it is highly structured schematic knowledge that's buried deep and accessible and fast, how do they interrogate that schema and make that system visible? And when we talk about training for people to do this, this is an enormously significant aspect of it. Because being an expert in your area does not mean that you're an expert in understanding your thinking at all. And that seems to be at the core. And I think one of the best mitigating factors against our cognitive biases is to lay out our thinking as much as we possibly can. This is the great principle of the Enlightenment, that it's not enough simply to make assertions, to appeal to authority. It is about making our thinking clear and visible. But the problems we have with expertise is that that's not often clear even to the expert. And the expertise in, as I say, a particular area does not necessarily extend into expertise in communicating thinking. And on it goes. But this kind of collaborative cognition in which we not only give each other the results of our completed cognition, but share the process with them, is one of the best ways to mitigate against our own biases. It's a social context that I think is enormously important. And Catherine, in your paper, and I think it was the current one under discussion, it is, you make the point, actually no, it was the previous one. The last thing you said in the previous one was, do you remember the last thing you said?
No.
Catherine, sorry. I was just testing. Some have argued that experts' level of confidence is less important than their reasoning, which leads to their opinion. Reasoning can be evaluated, debated and challenged, which is of importance in the fields of medicine which are interpretive disciplines. And this idea of getting into a very high inferential resolution and being able to zoom in and say, right there, that was the error. The great precedent we have, of course, is with judges and their legal opinions, because they write like that. They write with exquisite detail about their reasoning process and the facts of the matter on which they're based. And so, of course, but that's something I presume they're trained to do very well. But experts in other domains are not necessarily trained to do that very well, and I think that's one thing that could be a part of a really effective process. But in the current paper, Catherine, where you wrote, having trainees slow down and think aloud when formulating forensic opinions about suspicious injury may be a useful mechanism to reduce the risks. But I think that's exactly true of experts as well. If they can slow down and start to speak, even if they are in the process of training others, about why these decisions are going on in their minds, I think that's wonderfully instructional for them as well. And I'd like to also touch on the point of precision of language, Ben, that you touched on as well. And in the paper, I note, in one of the early papers, I think it was, when, how do you pronounce the name of the judge that gave that report in Ontario?
Googe.
Sorry?
Googe.
Googe,
Yeah.
yeah. The Googe report about the practice of child protection forensic paediatrics. And he's saying too, the basis of the opinion should be explicit in the contribution to the final opinion, just to make that point. But he also said the term consistent with should not be used, because it just means maybe or maybe not. Consistent with is a categorical statement. Okay, there's nothing that logically prevents it from being the case. But then we have the other words here, which I know, Ben, you used as well, of possible, plausible, and probable. And it almost sounds like these things are levels of epistemic certainty, but they're not. Because possible is a bit like consistent. It's just categorically in or out, and that's it. Plausible is about whether it seems coherent with what we already know, and that doesn't even have anything to do with probable. Well, I suppose it means it's possible as well. The only thing that talks about levels of certainty is the word probable. So it comes back to that point there. Okay, so I appreciate all of those ideas. However, I will come just in closing my last statement to say that I think the only thing that mitigates us against our cognitive biases is each other, and that our ability to integrate our thinking with each other, and to do that in a way that's more than simply, will you check what I've done for errors? We are talking about genuine collaboration, genuine sharing of ideas, genuine seeking out others to test our own thoughts and ideas. And I think that's a fundamental part of the training in any area of expertise, in fact, for anyone. It's a very important idea. Okay.